We're delighted today to be joined by Hannah King. Hannah is Assistant General Counsel at Shopify, which many of you are probably familiar with Shopify. They're the leading cloud-based multi-channel commerce platform. They have 4,000 employees in Canada, 75% of whom are aged between 25 and 39 years of age. Hannah joined Shopify in March of 2016. She was started out in private practice after doing her law degree at Dalhousie. She chose to go to another lesser firm, not ours, but that's okay. And then she had 2 stints as in-house counsel. We started working with Hannah and Shopify a few years ago, and I do honestly, it's been a fabulous experience because I have learned to try and not write like a lawyer. So I felt like the offer letter was more of a rap song originally, and everyone was like, no, dial it back, Lorna. Those words that you're trying to put in this offer letter, they're far too legal because we have this millennial workforce. So it's been a great experience. We're delighted to have Hannah with us and for what is, I think, to be a very interesting 40 minutes in front of us. Thanks.
Hey, everybody. So I'm going to start things off and talk about what is a millennial. So like all good legal problems, I went straight to Google and typed in what is a millennial, and I got a whole bunch of responses on it. So, you know, anybody born between 1976 and 1982, all the way up to 1990 to 2004. So that wasn't particularly helpful. So I went to Stats Canada and I decided to pick kind of 1980 to 1994. And in Canada, there are 7.8 million millennials, and I think all of them want to work at Shopify. According to a Stats Canada article that was published in April 2019 that sort of looked at the economic well-being across the generations, we found that generally millennials had a higher adjusted household incomes, but generally more debt. And in addition, millennials had a higher net worth linked to home ownership and higher education, primarily focused in the major metropolitan areas in Canada as well. If you haven't heard of Shopify, you may be living under a rock, but we're something of a tech darling at the moment. As Lorna said, we're a multi-channel commerce platform. And if you, we have more than 4,000 employees in I think I said 10 countries, but it's actually like 13. And if you look at my definition of the 25 to 39-year-olds, we have about 75% of our workforce are millennials, and if you actually use the expanded definition, about 90% of our workforce are millennials. Because we have a significant millennial workforce, a lot of what we actually offer employees really does sort of is focused towards those folks. So in addition to base salary, we have a lifestyle spending account, and it's crazy what you can actually submit under it. Cleaning services, gym memberships. I even checked the other day, anything that you buy that's a book you can submit, which is bananas. We have catered meals. We have on-site kitchens in some of our offices where we get breakfast, lunch, snacks. We have flex vacay, although our employment offers do actually have a set amount of vacation. We have a vacation policy that goes on top of that has a flex vacay. We have personal coaches. We have on-site haircuts. We have massages. We have bike tune-ups. We have sneaker drop washes. And in the springtime in our Toronto office for our dogs, we have massages. It's like, yeah. And then there's our offices as well. So we do not live in Cubeland at all. We operate in pods. There will be between 10 to 20 people in a pod with no walls. Between those folks, for lawyers who come in, it's actually really quite difficult because there are no places to put any of the paper that we're not supposed to actually print and look at. We have no filing cabinets. We had to go to IKEA and buy our own bookshelves for our minute books because we couldn't find anywhere to store those. But when you look at our facilities on a per square foot basis, it's actually the same as something would be like in Cubeland because we have a number of phone booths, pair programming booths, lounges, and places where people can go and do their work. Also, our technology is designed so that people can work from anywhere, coffee shops, from their homes, or if you're like me, in the front seat of your car while your kids are at soccer practice. So I'm going to review sort of 3 characteristics of millennials, and then Jackie and Lucy will go into sort of the more detailed legal aspects and implications of some of this stuff. when you do Google search millennials, there's a lot of crap written about them, but actually, working with so many of them, it is actually, they're a really great group of folks to work with, very, very dedicated, and I've definitely learned a lot. So I'm going to look at sort of three main areas, just sort of the technically savvy skills that they have, and the fact that there is no distinction between the online and offline world, and increased awareness about social and political issues, and a desire for feedback. So we'll look at tech savvy stuff first of all. I'll look at just a couple of areas on this. So we use Slack as an internal messaging tool. I don't know whether others are familiar with that, but it allows for direct messaging. And then there are also public and private channels that are set up. So at Shopify, we have over 2,000 channels. My favorite entertaining one is called Ageimals, where every Friday somebody will post a picture of an animal, and then we all have to guess the age of the animal. But there are actually a lot of professional channels as well. And so the pros of this is from an employee relations and employment law perspective is that actually, instead of the sort of virtual water cooler where you never hear those conversations, we actually will see some of these conversations happening. So we can actually get ahead of issues before they actually erupt, and that's quite useful. And the other thing is, too, we often have a written record of employees' conversations with each other leads to their employees. Sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes that's not a good thing, depending on what's actually being discussed. The cons of this sort of internal messaging is it's very, very casual. For Lorna and her team, whenever I have to show screenshots of conversations that have happened, they're like, how do people actually speak to each other like this in a work environment? It is all Giphies, memes, all those little emoticon things. They all actually dance. I couldn't get them to do that. And I mean, we have Slack bots. So like literally every time you type in dad joke, it will give you a different kind of a dad joke. It can be also used as a performance management tool, which again is good, but it doesn't have a lot of the usual caveats that we'd like to see as lawyers in terms of making sure that people are actually asking employees if they need accommodation for something, so that can work against us as well. Also, the sort of technically savvy nature of this workforce means that we often will run into issues on overtime hours because people are always on their devices. And so how do you actually, we don't track that, we have a flexible work day. So when we have had to look at that before, we will really have to go into people's calendars, their emails, and their Slack messages to see when they are sending and actually try and track how much they are working. And if we do find that people are working more, then we will actually try and document that as well, but that is something that we do run up against. We have documentation issues because nobody actually likes to write anything down sort of, longer than 3 sentences. Every single email that we send has to have a statement at the top. It's called a TLDR, too long, don't read, so that people will at least read that 2 sentences, and then you can put all the legal mumbo jumbo underneath, but nobody will actually read that. So as an example of that, we provide a legal presentation to all employees when they start, and these are 2 slides from that legal presentation. There are no real legal words in anything that we actually do. We actually say that you have to adult like a boss. Like the adulting like a boss is related to insider trading. Like there's a whole spiel that goes along with it, but that's actually the messages that we have to provide, which makes it a little bit difficult, again, to sort of enforce some of the approaches that we have. I mean, we have it all backed up on our internal vault, our intranet, but in terms of direct communication, we do sometimes run into issues on that side of things. And then lastly, on the tech side of things, tech sometimes works against us or for us on the ER side of things. We've had many instances where employees will call in sick, but because all of their colleagues follow them on Instagram or Snapchat or whatnot, that they will call in sick, but be posting pictures of them at Harry Potter World. We've also, I think I did cause Lorna to say I haven't heard of this before in my umpteen years of practice. I had an employee who identified themselves as an employee and had written a blog about microdosing with LSD for a period of a month, including her time at work, because it allowed her to be more creative. And she said, can I post this? I'm like, it's LSD, it's a controlled substance. No, so there's an education that goes along with that. And then also on the more serious side of things, we can run into issues with harassment, again, because of this, this division between, no division between online and offline world, that because people do follow each other on social media, how do you actually deal with somebody thinking that they have a potential personal relationship with somebody else, and how do you sort of get that division between what's professional in the work environment and what is actually in the personal sphere. Second thing that I wanted to look at was sort of social and political activism, and this, goes right up to the top of our organization. Toby Lutke, our CEO, just published a mini manifesto on climate change and carbon recapture in September, and we announced a sustainability fund last month as well. And so that manifests itself in many ways. For instance, last month when we had the climate strikes happening in all of the major cities, it was how do we actually deal with folks who want to strike from work. So we had to develop comms around that. We also have to explain to folks sort of, what does it mean to have a duty of loyalty to your employer, even though you may have, your own social or political beliefs. So for instance, Shopify has an acceptable use policy related to the merchants who are on our platform, and more than half of the reports that we actually get under that acceptable use policy are internally generated from employees, where they come across a merchant that they believe violates that policy. And Proud Boys is an example of that, although they were already on our radar. Additionally, we have employee resource groups. So instead of having a sort of top-down approach to diversity, inclusion, and belonging, we have encouraged employees to actually set up ERGs. So even though they all have an executive sponsor, they are run by employees, and the mandates and the actions of these ERGs are actually, it's all employee-driven, and those have actually been quite effective. And then we also run into issues because we are very keen on encouraging belonging and diversity in our workforce, where I'm constantly talking to the folks on the talent acquisition side of things who want to sort of categorize people and catalog marginalized groups and sort of collect that data. So we've had some issues where people have said, I believe that person may be racialized based on their name, and they'll sort of, qualify people, and we've told them that they can't do that. So. And then sort of as a last kind of characteristic of millennials, feedback is an area where we really I've really noticed it to be a big difference. On a typical day, I'll probably interact with about 50 to 100 people. And when I first started at Shopify, the very next day, about half of those people would come back and say, can I have some feedback about what we did yesterday? And that was, I was more used to sort of feedback happening on a 6-month or annual basis rather than a daily basis. So that was a little bit of a change. But at Shopify, we do talk about feedback being a gift, and so most people are actually good at giving feedback, again, via Slack. We do run into issues on the sort of constructive, critical feedback kind of things, because a lot of folks do feel that when they've received constructive feedback that it's actually bullying or harassment. So we have to educate them on that side of things. And again, we have documentation is sometimes an issue for this sort of stuff. So we do have sort of formal templates for performance improvement plans, which are lovely and wonderful, but it's making sure that people actually use those. And then we also have another sort of philosophy at Shopify that you can 10x your career, which means that we often run into over-enthusiastic career expectations. So it's quite common for somebody who's been working for us for 6 months to feel that they should be having a promotion or a raise or more equity or something because of the impact that they've actually had during their first 6 months. We do conduct an annual employee survey called our Pulse Survey. We actually have a pretty good response rate, a 90% response rate, so we're actually able to sort of collect that information from folks. It has, sort of standard type employee surveys that you would see, but also a lot of weird questions like, do you have a best friend at work, and what's your favorite Star Wars movie, and that sort of stuff. And the other tool that we implemented about 18 months ago to sort of help on the feedback side is something called Fellow. I have no affiliation with Fellow, but what it does is it links to our Slack and our calendars. And it basically ensures that leads are having one-to-one meetings with their direct reports every 2 weeks. And it allows for note capturing both from the lead and the direct report, as well as collecting feedback from other people who've worked on projects. So it's a way that we actually use to try and actually collect feedback so that we have some documentation. So that's the very quick survey of Shopify millennials, and I'll pass it on to Lucy and Jackie to continue.
Thanks, Hannah. That was great. So as Lorna mentioned, my name's Lucy, and me and my colleague Jackie, as the team's resident millennials, will be taking you through the rest of the presentation. So as you'll see, we've included some pertinent tweets to prove that we're technologically savvy as millennials. Don't worry, these are our section dividers, they're not our tips for employers. So as Hannah's outlined, there are some particular millennial traits that are going to influence how they operate or how we operate in the workplace. So what we have done is we've pulled from those traits and looked at, distilled them into essentially 3 sort of broad topics which you as an employer can use to manage, retain and attract millennial workers. So and I think that's important because millennials are now actually the largest generation in the workforce. So, and increasingly moving into leadership roles and have specialized talents. So, so you may actually want millennials in your workforce despite the potential risk of microdosing. So the first thing that millennials want in the workplace is flexibility. Hannah's spoken to this already, but as she mentioned, we don't typically expect there to be a strict work-life separation anymore. So Jackie's going to discuss how to implement and make this flexibility work within your workplace. And then the second broad topic is workplace mobility. So millennials, because we grew up in the global financial crisis, we don't necessarily expect to be staying in one business for a long period of time. So that means that we typically see work as a way to build professional equity. We want to be developing, and we want to make sure that our work is going to improve our skills in the short term rather than the long term. So Hannah, as she mentioned, that feeds into that need for feedback, but it also means that we need to discuss how that works within your business when people are moving around a lot more than they perhaps used to. And then finally, again, those value-based decision-making. We've talked about the climate strikes. There's also that growing trend towards expecting corporate responsibility and addressing social issues within the workplace, not just on our free time. So as millennials, obviously we expect those things. Some of those tasks may require sort of board or top level buy-in, but there are ways that you can implement that value-based decision-making expectation within your workplace at a lower level. So for example, showing just a commitment to values and inclusivity when compared to other people within the industry or other employers. So Jackie's going to take us through flexible working arrangements, and Jackie, maybe I'll just do the clickers and you just tell me.
Yeah. Okay, so as Lucy and Hannah have both mentioned, the millennial workforce is much more likely than prior generations to see their home life and their work life as blended. And in response to this, Lucy and I have come up with 3 policies that you may want to consider implementing if you want to respond to this demand for flexibility. So the first policy that we're going to talk about are remote work arrangements, or essentially an employee working from home, sometimes also known as telecommuting. There are some obvious benefits with remote work arrangements. Of course, who doesn't want to work at home in their pajamas? But in addition to that, studies have also shown that it can improve overall health and wellness in your employees. It can improve retention, and it also prevents burnout. So we are seeing a lot of benefits with this. But with that in mind, if it's a policy you are considering, then we've put together our top 6 list of issues that you should turn your mind to before you implement this policy. So the first issue that you should turn your mind toward is tracking hours of work. And as Hannah mentioned, when you're allowing employees to have, whether it be flex time or remote work arrangements, it becomes more difficult to track when they're actually working. But this does not relieve your obligations with respect to keeping track of making sure they have meal breaks or rest periods. As well, you still need to make sure that if employees are working overtime, they're being compensated for that. So just keep in mind, whether they're at home or they're in the workplace, you still have your record keeping and hours of work requirements under the Employment Standards Act. The second issue you may want to consider is productivity. So of course, if they're no longer in your office physically, it becomes a bit more difficult to keep an eye on whether they're being productive or not. So what you're going to want to do is make sure you have measures in place that can respond to this and ensure that time they're spending, that they're being compensated for, are productive hours of work. So one example of how you might want to do this is implementing, reasonable monitoring measures in accordance with applicable law to ensure that hours of work at home are still conducive to the business needs. The third consideration, altering terms of employment, is something our colleagues Tamara and Kathleen discussed at length, so I'm not going to get into it too much, but just if this is a policy you're thinking about implementing for the first time, it may be that you want to have a trial phase. So this is something available to you if you want to see how it goes with your employees first. Just make sure there are clear expectations and they're aware that if it goes well, it might become a permanent arrangement, but for the time being, it is a trial phase, something that you can choose to take away at a future date. Moving on to the fourth consideration, security of information. So this is a concept that's going to pop up a few times during our presentation, because when you allow employees to be more flexible with where and how they work, of course there are security issues that pop up in tandem with that. So allowing company property, perhaps confidential client information, to go off-site presents a few security issues, and it's something you may need to collaborate with your tech team on, whether it be making sure company property that they work on from home has the same security measures as you would expect in your office. So that could be ensuring there are good passcodes, malware installed, being able to wipe devices remotely, whatever security measures you have in place for your company property at the office, you should also have in place when an employee is working remotely. The fifth one is actually an emerging legal concept. So because we've seen a rise in employees working from home, this means we've also had to consider what our definition of the workplace really is. And this plays into occupational health and safety legislation. So the Occupational Health and Safety Act of Ontario, it has a very broad definition of what the workplace is. And you might have come into contact with this before, but it's essentially anywhere that your employees perform work. So not that helpful, very broad. Anywhere that your employees perform work is the workplace. However, there's also a carve out for private residences. So on its face, it says that the legislation does not apply to work when it's performed in a private residence. So it becomes a really tricky sticking point where your employees are performing work, they're not in your office, they're in a private residence. What happens with health and safety legislation? So there's a very limited number of case law that can guide our interpretation at this point. So from a preliminary perspective, what we're advising is just to be cautious. So whatever obligations you have in your office, whether it be recording any accidents, whether it be reporting any accidents, just make sure that you're taking the cautious approach and erring on the side of caution until we have more case law on the topic that can inform your decision. And then the sixth and final issue that you may want to consider if a work arrangement is right for you is the cost of initial setup. In Ontario, this is not something you're required to provide, so you do not have to pay for an employee to have a remote work arrangement. It's something that you would agree to in a contract, or maybe you agree orally. But if it is something you're considering, then Lucy and I thought you might want to be aware of the T2200. And so Lucy will take a moment now to discuss the T2200 with you.
Great, thanks, Jackie. So yes, if you decide that your millennial employee can work from home, or as we would prefer to call it, become a digital nomad, then there can be some tax consequences. So as you're probably all aware, typically an employee is not entitled to deduct any employment-related expenses. That's considered compensation through their employer, so it would be taxable and you couldn't deduct for it. However, There is one carve out to this, and that is where an employee is required to incur the expense, for example, required to work from home in his or her employment contract. So if that is the case, then the employee may be able to deduct those expenses from their income. And this, as I mentioned, the ability to deduct is contingent on the employee being required to pay the expense. So if you do want to take advantage of this potential ability to deduct, then you want to consider that, if you have it under a policy and it's flexible and can be revoked, then that will not entitle the employee to make those deductions. However, if you do have it as this is a term of your employment and you're required to work from home, then the employee will be able to deduct, and you could take that into account when you're creating the compensation package for that employee who's working from home. So looking specifically at working from home, because that would be generally the larger expense, the CRA's position is, as I've already discussed, it needs to be required under a contract of employment, and it also needs to be where the employee is performing the majority of their work. So the CRA's position is that that is more than 50% of the time. And then if the other option is if they're not performing the majority of their time at home, then you can also potentially deduct where the space at home is only used for the employment function. So for example, where an employee has a room that's set up to meet clients, they use that space regularly and continually and for the purpose of work, and that's required. So if the employee does claim these deductions, there is a requirement that the employer complete what's called a T2200, which is also called a Declaration of Conditions of Employment. And this form doesn't actually need to be filed with the CRA, but it does need to be kept by the employee for 6 years to substantiate those expenses. And of course, the employee can't double dip. So if you receive one of these forms and you've actually reimbursed the employee for these expenses, then that needs to be reflected. And then on the flip side, the employee is required to fill out what's called a T777. That's not your problem. So just a little point to consider if you are thinking of implementing these arrangements.
Okay, and the second trend we've started to see with the millennial workforce is a move away from what is the traditional view of paid vacation. So as Hannah said, they have a set amount of vacation in their employment agreements, but in actuality, they can take, I believe, as much as they want time off. Yeah, so this is exactly the concept of unlimited vacation, sometimes also known as having no vacation or unlimited paid time off. And of course, that sounds amazing, but why on earth would an employer want to provide their employees with unlimited paid time off? Well, so we're seeing benefits on both sides to this policy. From the employer's perspective, what we've seen is that employees actually take less time off, and they are significantly happier to know that they have unlimited time off that they could take. It also means that you have fewer types of leave that you need to track, at least in theory, because all of your types of leave will be encompassed in this one, whether it be unlimited paid time off, and that includes sick time and vacation and whatever else they need. Maybe they need time off to care for their children. All of that would be included in one type of leave that you're tracking and recording. The third is kind of a practical concern, which is if an employee runs out of vacation time and then suddenly they become sick a little bit more often. Sometimes we have clients who are questioning, is my employee really sick, or are they just out of vacation time? There's no longer a concern with unlimited vacation, so you're not questioning whether your employees are actually sick anymore. And then on the flip side, from an employee's perspective, of course, it meets that demand for flexibility, which is great. And then there is also an element of transparency in the process, and it allows your employees to all have an equal entitlement to time off, whether they are sick or not. So we're seeing benefits on both sides, and we definitely understand why our clients and their employees like these policies. But with that in mind, it is a policy we caution about because there is a legal framework that needs to be adhered to, and we've seen some difficulties arise when clients try to provide unlimited vacation. So what is the legal framework? Well, under the Employment Standards Act, there is no concept of paid time off. What we're actually working within is a concept of vacation time, vacation pay, the new sick leave that was just implemented in the past year, although it is unpaid under the ESA, and we have other types of leave as well. So with that legal framework in mind, what issues are we seeing arise with these policies? Well, our biggest concern is with respect to vacation pay and vacation time. So under the Employment Standards Act, you are required to keep track of the amount of vacation pay and vacation time that you provide to your employees. So whether you have unlimited vacation or not, with respect to the statutory amounts, you need to make sure that you're still recording these regardless of how much time an employee takes. In addition to that, as you may know, you cannot forfeit vacation pay under the Employment Standards Act. So if your employee ends up actually taking less time off, it could become a concern because they'll still continue to accrue vacation pay. And you don't want to end up down the line, an employee has been with your company for 10 years, has never taken vacation, and then they end up being terminated and have a huge accrual in their vacation pay bank that you have to pay all at one time. So just another concern to keep in mind, you can still schedule your employees for a vacation, and you're going to want to make sure they at least take their statutory minimum requirements. The last concern that I have up on the screen are approved leaves of absences. So one move we've been implementing in our clients' policies for vacation and for this unlimited vacation policy is ensuring that only the minimum statutory requirements continue to accrue during approved leaves of absences. And the reason for this is under the ESA, you have to continue accruing vacation while an employee is on a leave of absence. So it's less of a concern when you have a very short leave of absence, but for example, if you have an employee who now goes on an 18-month pregnancy combined with parental leave, if they continue to accrue, whether it be 3 or 4 weeks of paid time off, and it's all included as one concept, then maybe they come back after 1.5 years and now they have 4.5 weeks of paid time off in addition while being off on leave. So what you'll want to do is make sure that only so essentially except as required by statute, it will not accrue. And that way you prevent additional vacation pay accruals after they've been on an approved leave of absence. So key takeaways, it is a great policy. We definitely understand why employers and employees both like it, but just keep in mind there are some considerations that need to go in the policy, and you're going to want to make sure that your policies are quite carefully drafted. Okay, and the third policy and final policy we'll talk about with respect to flexibility is our BYOD policies. So for those unfamiliar, BYOD means bringing your own device to work. The alternative to BYOD is a corporate-owned and provided device. So with a BYOD policy, what you have is your employees bringing their own personal devices to work, and then they're able to have your work installed onto that device. They only have to carry one phone. The benefits we've seen to this are reduced initial device costs. So an employee's bringing their own phone, you don't have to pay for it. That's great. You also have improved employee satisfaction. I don't know of many employees who'd want to carry around and charge 2 phones every day. So it's kind of nice you can consolidate and have one phone at a time. We've also seen increased productivity. This may also be a millennial consideration, but I always have my phone on me. So if my work is on my phone, then that's great news for my employer. I'm never disconnected. And then it also prevents unauthorized BYOD. So if you tell an employee they can't use their phone for corporate work, odds are they're still going to text their colleagues if they don't have their work phone on them. So by allowing them to use their own phone, you're preventing them from doing it without your authorization. That's definitely a pro as well. So a lot of our clients already have informal BYOD policies. It's something that's a bit more common than some of the other policies we'll talk about. But if you want to distill it down to a written policy, then there are some considerations that we've put on the screen for crafting an effective BYOD policy. And we've limited it to the top 4 you'll want to think about, the first of which is security. So the same concerns we had with the remote work arrangement will continue to apply here. You want to make sure appropriate security measures are in place if you're allowing your employees to use their phone. So strong passcodes, ability to wipe the device, all of the typical things you would see with your corporate-owned and provided devices should apply with your employees' phones as well. The second is internal policy enforcement. One switch we've seen with millennials is that they question policies that they don't understand. So whenever you have an employee, a policy in place with your millennial workers, you're going to want to be able to explain why it is you have that policy. So if you tell an employee, oh, at any time we can wipe your device, and it's their personal phone, they might think, oh, hey, why? Why can you do that? And so if you're able to respond and say, oh, well, if it's lost or stolen, we don't want our confidential client information out there, then that makes sense to them and they're more willing to accept it. So just make sure you have a way to explain the rationale behind your policies before you implement them. The third concern is privacy. So if there is an intermingling of personal and employer material on a phone, you're going to want to set clear expectations for what privacy concerns are. So in your policy, you'll definitely want to mention, you don't have an expectation of privacy when the phone is used for business purposes, for example, and you'll just want to make sure that that's spelled out explicitly in any policy that you make. And the last is harassment, and Hannah touched on this a bit earlier, but the concern is really if you're using your personal phone for anything that's an extension of the workplace, there is a concern that it can be harassment, workplace harassment. So what you're going to want to do in your policies, make sure that your anti-harassment policies continue to apply to any devices that are used for work purposes. So despite the risks, in our view, the key takeaway is that employees are probably already using their personal phone for this purpose. So instead of just resisting, it might be best to put a policy in place and spell out what the expectations are.
Great. So now we're going to talk about the mobile workforce in millennials. So over the past decade, mobile work and workplace mobility has really increased, and there's been a huge increase in what we like to call the gig economy. And interestingly, that's not just things like Uber or Foodora. It's also more than a fifth of Canada's professionals who are in precarious work of some sort. So that might be part-time or contract or freelance work. So as an employer who's looking to engage or employ individuals within this gig economy or this mobile workforce, there are a number of issues for you to consider. So the first of which is if it is a engagement and you're looking to hire a contractor, you need to remember the control and integration test. So misclassification can be costly, as we are probably all aware by now. You want to make sure that the employee is actually, or the individual is not an employee, and that they're engaging in what's called a side hustle, or they're not dependent or integrated in a role that would be more appropriate to be filled by an employee. And then when you're looking at whether to employ someone on a fixed term, caution is also warranted. So in our view, the benefits of this are primarily practical in setting expectations rather than this being something that is advantageous from a legal perspective. So as a reminder, under common law, if you've got an employee who's under a fixed term and they're terminated before the expiry of that term, then their damages are actually the period from termination to the end of the term, rather than what you would otherwise calculate on a common law or a common law basis, which is why you need to make sure you've got an early out. You need to make sure you've got a contractual termination clause that would be effective at this point. And we actually just saw a case where an individual under a 10-year fixed term was awarded 9 years of damages when he was constructively dismissed. So this can be material. And so you want to also take into account the fact that if a fixed term is for more than 1 year, the employee is entitled to their statutory termination entitlements and also severance pay if it's over 5 years. So even if the fixed term expires, you want to make sure that the employee is given those entitlements, otherwise they could claim for common law damages. And so just as a takeaway, because I know we're running out of time a little bit, I'm going to skip forward to just a general comment on workplace mobility. It can be excellent for an employer. And as a business point, it means that knowledge within an industry is transferred. Your employees are going to obtain varied and different knowledge than they would potentially get within your workforce. But of course, the flip side is that when an excellent employee wants to leave, that means that you are then having to look for new employees. You've got increased recruitment costs, and you potentially have risks with your confidential and proprietary information, which Jackie's covered in great detail. So a good way, and something that you might want to consider, is allowing that learning and mobility within your workplace by allowing something like a secondment.
Millennials are less willing than prior generations to stick with an employer if it means sacrificing their own professional development. So job security is less important to this generation than it was to prior generations, as is perhaps loyalty to one company, just because they've seen prior generations lose their jobs. You know, they want to make sure that their own professional resources have been built up as best they can. So a solution that we've seen that will allow your employees to develop skills that they may not be able to develop in your workplace is offering a secondment. For those unfamiliar, a secondment is where an employee leaves your original workplace and they go work with a host or perhaps a different area within your company. And then at the end of the term, it's a temporary arrangement, they come back to their original job. So the benefits to this, it allows them to continue their personal growth. It lets them develop some new skills or gain some experience. Perhaps it expands their network. And it can also cover short-term absences. So there are some benefits we've seen with secondments. So then if secondments are something you want to offer, what are the considerations that should go into this? Well, the first consideration, of course, is selection criteria. So is this something that your workplace wants to have generally available to employees, or is it something that maybe only your high achievers will have access to? And that'll inform the policy that you develop, whether it's publicly available or perhaps just communicated to a select few. The second is the secondment agreement. So there will be 3 parties generally involved in an external secondment. There will be the host, the original employer, and the employee. And you're going to want to make sure that the terms of the secondment are clearly laid out and all parties understand what's going on, what the expectations are. The third consideration we have up there is your liability as the employer. So when an employee goes to work for another employer, although that host organization will generally be with them on a day-to-day basis, you're going to want to make sure that the liability of the employer stays with you and that it does not transfer. So that's a consideration that will go into your agreement. And the last consideration is payment of wages. Generally, with an external secondment, it will be the original employer that continues to pay the wages of the employee. However, you can agree to whichever arrangement you want in the secondment agreement. Maybe there are some costs incurred by the host as a condition of hosting the employee, and you want those to be covered by the host. That can be agreed to in the agreement.
So now we're going to talk about values-based decision making. And as I mentioned previously, it might be that you can't implement a business-wide corporate social responsibility policy in the short term, but what you can do is look at ways to make your business more inclusive and value-driven just within your particular sectors. So, as we mentioned, as sort of a bit of background, millennials are more likely to suffer burnout, anxiety, and depression. And as you can see on that graph, that is more than previous generations. And millennials are also more likely to talk about mental health at work. So as an employer, you want to be aware of the potential implications of that willingness to share, because it can get you in a little bit of trouble. So Kathleen and Alex are going to discuss accommodation and disability management in a great deal of depth after the break. But just from sort of a broad-based perspective, employers who become aware that an employee might have a disability that's affecting their work will have a duty to accommodate them and to take that into account if they're looking to make an adverse decision in respect of that employee. So where you're aware that, for example, an employee is taking medication for a mental health related concern, then you may want to consider that and look into it before you're making a decision to, for example, terminate them for poor performance. For example, there was a tribunal case where an employee informed their manager that they had ADHD. And in that case, the manager decided to just do a quick Google and use those Google search results to change the way he was managing. When that didn't work, unsurprisingly, it didn't work, the manager decided that the employee needed to be terminated for poor performance. And as you can anticipate, the tribunal did not look too kindly onto that. They decided that there was some prima facie discrimination in that decision, and that in fact the employer needed to actually consult and accommodate with the employee's involvement and with the involvement of the employee's medical professional. So what can you do as an employer if you become aware of some of these issues? Well, your benefits should be helpful. Often you'll see benefits covering psychological issues now, to the extent they didn't before. They can also cover mental health related leave. And also EAP can be a useful tool, and this one I think is worth pulling out in a little bit of detail, because not only can EAP be used by your employees, it can also be used by managers and by HR within a company to, for example, get a little bit of tips on how to manage someone who seems to be struggling on the basis of a psychological issue. So for example, in that case, instead of going to Google, the manager could have called up the EAP provider, who might have given a few more useful tips, which could then be used and discussed in consultation with the employee. And just as a reminder, WSIB coverage does provide for both chronic and traumatic mental stress entitlements, and I'm not going to go into any detail on that. It was covered in our last presentation, which is available online.
Okay, and so our last two policies that we're going to discuss are sabbaticals and volunteer time off. And these are both policies that we thought would help to address this values-based decision-making that we've seen with the millennial generation. So what are they? Well, volunteer time off is an amount of paid time off that you can provide to your employees to volunteer with an organization, whether it be one that you've selected or they've selected. That would be set out in your policy. They're generally quite short-term and maybe a short amount of time per year or every other year. It's however you structure your policy. By contrast, a sabbatical is generally a much longer period of time off, and it recurs on a less frequent basis. So it may be that as a retention strategy, you have a sabbatical available that occurs every 5 years, and then it would be for a longer period of time. It used to be more common in academia and religious vocations, but we have seen it moving into other industries as well, so maybe it's something you want to consider for your workplace. Since these two have similar concerns, we've grouped them into one slide. So up there on the slide, we have the parameters you'd want to consider for sabbaticals and volunteer time off. The considerations are eligibility, entitlements, and expectations. So you want to know which employees will be eligible, maybe how often, how much time will they be entitled to, and you also want to set out how many employees can take advantage of this opportunity at the same time. And the intention of those parameters is to address the pitfalls at the bottom half of the screen. So the pitfalls you'd want to avoid if you want to offer sabbaticals and volunteer time off are having multiple employees on leave at one time. So this is especially a concern if you have a smaller workplace, maybe you only have 10 employees at a location. You wouldn't want, say, 3 or 4 of those employees off volunteering with an organization at the same time. You want to be able to control when this time is taken and how many employees are taking it at the same time. So the second pitfall you'd want to avoid is affiliation with organizations whose values do not align with your own. So if an employee is being paid for time off while they're volunteering or perhaps pursuing personal ventures, you want to make sure that you're not paying them and having your name associated with a company that maybe whose values are not necessarily those that you share. So you'd want to have that spelled out in the organization, whether it's the final decision rests in your sole discretion. You know, you can approve whether it is an organization they can volunteer with or not. And then the last pitfall are accruals and carry forward. I feel like I've droned on about this for the whole presentation, but if you are providing paid time off, you want to make sure that it doesn't carry forward from year to year, so that employees don't end up with a huge bank of time that you're paying for them to go off for, you know, months or however long volunteering, if the intent was only so that they have maybe 5 days per year. And in connection with accruals, there is a point we wanted to mention, which is if you have a sabbatical option available, there is something that you can take advantage of known as a deferred salary leave plan. So essentially what happens is an employee in your workplace can have a plan structured so that part of their salary goes toward this, so they have a bank available to them so that they can take time off in the future that they've already accrued pay toward, and it'll pay them for their time off. So if this is something you're thinking about putting a sabbatical in, just let us know and we can connect you with our benefits specialist, Allison.
Great, so I think we're actually running quite out of time, so we can just leave you with this slide. You're going to receive a copy of the presentations, and these are just sort of points to consider, pitfalls to avoid, things to think about when you're looking at managing a millennial workplace.